And really, this is where we talk about moving ourselves from to being lifelong learners. Like this is a lifelong process in which we examine our own beliefs. We have been indoctrinated by these different stereotypes from birth, within our own families, from society. This is a lifelong process to really unpack and examine our own beliefs, our cultural identity, the bias and values that we may hold. This requires that if we are in a position of privilege, that we have to really undo and really think about how we can become students of the world more, and not from the place of privilege, but from a place of really collaboration and working with others along that. And really, that's where we talk about is just like, how do you become the student in this sort of process of understanding other cultures and other identities? And this is really the crux of this piece of the training, is like, how do we become stewards of resources for our contacts, and really thinking through not placing value judgments on anyone, but really working in partnership around our contacts' own beliefs and their particular identities. So really that is the purpose of this and how we move through. So let's go through to the next poll. And which of the following is not a principle of culture humility? Okay, so far, this is great. It seems like you've been paying attention. So it's really looking at mastery of other languages. That's where the majority of you are coming in. I think that that's really important. We're not asking you to really become a master of other languages. We're really just asking you to unpack what you've learned, all this lifelong learning and critical self-reflection, and really thinking about how you recognize that power and balance and privilege, and then where within these institutions in particular, you're gonna be in a position of power where you may not be thinking that, but just calling with this information puts you in a position of power. Calling from a potential government agency puts you in a position of power. So it's really important when you're thinking through this, your power balance in having these calls. So let's move to the next slide, please. So these are just the principles of cultural humility. So again, it's lifelong learning and critical self-reflection. It's recognizing and challenging power imbalance and respectful partnerships, and urging institutional accountability. So those are the things that I just talked about while you were doing the poll. But really, like I said, with cultural humility, it's always a lifelong learning. It's not something that you can pick up just from this webinar. It's something that you will need to really think about and unpack for yourself, to really think about how do you approach not only these calls, but just the way in which you engage around different identities, and so forth. So let's go to the next slide. And I think we talked about this, and really just the recognizing and challenging power, this behavior is just like I said before, is like you're calling them, contacts are going to be vulnerable. That right there is a power dynamic. You have information about them. They don't have information about you. You're asking them to do something that they may not have the ability to do, whether it's housing instability, whether it's having to work, socioeconomic issues. Those are all things that they don't have the power. And what you do is you have the power because you're bringing them resources, you're providing them with this information that they didn't know. So just for us to be very aware of that, and that power imbalance and that structure. And then that also, like, just the history of calling from healthcare and what people's experiences are around healthcare potentially, and the mistrust that may go with that. So that's all power that potentially you have, and just recognizing that power and how we address that. Next slide, please. And when we talk about institutional accountability, you may have seen this picture to the right, where we talk about equity, equality, reality, and then liberation. And really what institutional accountability is, just looking at removing the structural barriers within institutions. How does it look? And then that self-reflection and critique are required in order to move those barriers. And a lot of times that's at a large policy level. Those are things that we're thinking about in terms of those institutional accountability and how you really address that. In this situation, we just want to be cognizant of that when we're doing these kinds, sort of these institutional barriers that may occur for those folks within the system who we're contacting, but those are larger systemic structures that we would be discussing at a different date. But around this, we just want to be really aware of that. So let's move on to the next slide, please. And so cultural humility approach is really to admit that you don't know. So you don't know everything about every identity or every experience, and just admitting that when you're having these calls with people as they explain their own experience and what they're going through. You don't have to say, I understand, I agree with you. It's really just to provide that empathy and say, I'm here to support. How can I support? What are some of the things, and help them think through what is best for them. To suspend your judgment. So I talked about this earlier, in which we talk about names. So there was a very famous research study where they did resumes, and people, they changed out the names for what they consider to be ethnic sounding first names and last names, and they were the same exact resumes. And those people who had ethnic sounding first names and last names were called less frequently than those who had names that are considered standard American names. That survey showed that even when you just look at a name, that implicit bias begins. And so that's something that really think about and contextualize when you're doing these calls, is that even when you're just reading those names of the contacts that you're about to call during your shift, that those names can elicit implicit bias from the beginning. So that's where you want to suspend judgment. You want to have build a place of empathy. Again, empathy comes from the place of that these folks are vulnerable. You're now telling them to isolate, and there's a variety of experiences that they may be having that don't allow for that, or that will make that very complicated. So we need to really be open to that. We need to celebrate their diversity, and just in thinking through that, and systemically check your assumptions. So throughout the process, we will provide a checklist for you to think about after each shift that really checks where these biases may have come up. And then just be comfortable in the ambiguity. Be comfortable that you may not know the answers for individuals. You may not know the answers for individual specific circumstances, and to be comfortable with that. I think that that's very important when you're doing this work, is that you are able to sit in the discomfort of not being able to help every single person, and not be able to truly understand every person's experience and why they're choosing the routes that they may be choosing, but to provide them with the best support that you possibly can. Let's move to the next slide. So example of how this shows up in the script is when we talk about personal information. So you've gone through the script, and now you're going to ask them around before, and here's an example, I'll just read it. Before we finish, there are a few more details I'd like to ask you about. This will help us better understand how to protect your household and community from COVID-19. Again, this information will be provided to the California Department of Public Health and your local health department, but will not be shared with anyone else and will be confidential. Can you tell me your race, gender identity, and sexual orientation? And we're going to go into details a little bit more on talking about sexual orientation and gender identity. But these are sensitive topics for people to want to ask. And we talk about why we ask those and why it's important for us to ask these information, that this isn't about violating people's privacy and that we need to pry and know everything that happens, but really it's talking about vulnerable populations and how historically these vulnerable populations of race, gender, and sexual orientation have historically been omitted or not given the proper health care because of their identities. And so it's important that we name these identities so that we're able to provide the appropriate amount of support to vulnerable communities. That is the bottom line of why we're asking these questions and why it's important for us to get that information. So let's move to the next slide, please. And so here we're talking about sexual orientation and gender identity, and really you're supporting an inclusive understanding of how COVID-19 is affecting all communities. And that's why we ask these questions and why we ask questions around these demographics. And sexual orientation and gender identity are demographic information that we need to see how all vulnerable populations are being impacted. And vulnerable populations go from gender, race, sexual orientation, age, all of these things are part of that vulnerable populations that we need to understand how it's being impacted by COVID. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So this is why we're asking. It helps provide the best care for everybody. It signals acceptance, which can be meaningful to clients. It supports accurate data collection. One thing too, in addition to just collecting data and understanding and really being able to support vulnerable populations, is we also want to be able to give appropriate understand appropriately the context of who we're talking to. So we want to be able to provide the appropriate resources and support that for each identity and population that we're working with, and also historically to be able to collect that data to help them further down the line. So next slide, please. And so how we frame this question is we're asking, and I'll just read it so you'll know, is we're asking everyone about sexual orientation, gender identity, and race, so we can gather the best information on how COVID-19 affects every group. We have a two-step question regarding gender to collect better data and demonstrate inclusivity. One, the first part of the two-part is how would you describe your sexual orientation? And then which of the following best represents your racial or ethnic identity? So those are how we frame the questions when we're asking. And you'll get an opportunity to practice that today or during your practice session with the script. So can you go to the next section, please? And one thing we want to move to is, so after all of this, is we provide, so you've done your shift, you've asked the questions, is how do you provide a critical self-awareness? That's part of doing the culture of humility, is doing this sort of self-check-in. And how do you, this checklist here that we provided is really an opportunity for you to think through how you're adhering to and removing your biases during these conversations. So the first thing is, do I offer contacts in case it's the same information, tests, and recommendations? If so or not, what informs this? So really thinking through, am I different with each caller in terms of how I provide information? What are those barriers? Or even looking at a particular call, why it was tough, why you didn't want to provide that information, why you maybe have glossed over it, versus a previous call where you were very comfortable and you gave all the information. What assumptions do I make about context based on our conversation and information that they give? What are the personal cultural values or beliefs, and how do these influence my personal, and cultural values or beliefs, and how do these influence my approach to this work? In what ways have fear, ignorance, and systemic oppression, including but not limited to ageism, classism, ethnocentrism, heterosexism, racism, and sexism, influenced my attitudes and actions? What are the steps I can take to minimize the effects of this personal biases? How can I use self-awareness to appreciate the multicultural identities of clients, patients, and colleagues? So that's just a critical self-awareness check that you can do at the end of each of your shifts. I also encourage people to really think through, if you are able to answer these questions, to have them for you at the beginning of each of your shift, and sort of as you're preparing your toolkit for that shift, to also do a quick walkthrough of sort of how you're going to show up for each individual around these biases and how you're going to suspend them. So I think that that's really important. If we could just go to the next slide. And just the guidelines for cross-cultural interactions is really, we want to be empathetic. We want to have empathy. It's an action. It's how we show up. It shows them that we're really there for them in terms of this moment. We do this by active listening. We do this by providing reflective language, and you'll learn about all of these sort of active listening skills throughout the different presentations as you learn in this training. We want to be curious. We want to, really ask them questions that you're interested about what is happening to them, how it's impacting their lives and their loved ones. So we want to show up and be curious about that. We don't want to just read through the questions. As you learn the script and sort of put it into, I think it's really important, as Hannah said, to put this into your own words potentially, because that will allow for you to really create a conversation. So it doesn't feel like you're just reading off of the script just to get to the next question. So I think as you do